All right, good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for an overview of health and safety regulations for small businesses. And thank you to our panelists, presenters today. Maureen Kotlas, Executive Director for Environmental Safety, Sustainability, and Risk at the University of Maryland, and Mary Dorman, Assistant Director for ESSR Office of Research and Safety. They're very knowledgeable in all questions regarding safety regulations, and I'm sure you will learn a lot today in today's workshop. If you have any questions, please submit those questions via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If you mouse over the bottom of your screen, you will see a Q&A icon. Just click on that and submit your questions. And either Mary or Maureen will answer them. And Wendy, who is our moderator today, will also be monitoring that section. One quick announcement, today's session is being recorded and it will be posted on our YouTube channel. So if you missed something and you would like to review that material again, you will be able to do so if you go to our YouTube channel. So again, thank you so much, Mary, Maureen, and thank you to Wendy for moderating today's session. We can go ahead and begin.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Once again, I'm Maureen Kotlas, and my colleague Mary Dorman and I are going to be presenting on a number of regulations that can impact small businesses. So I'm going to kick this off. I'll start with the first sets of slides, and then Mary's going to talk about specific research safety related slides. Sorry, just trying to get this to advance. Okay. I have to give a disclaimer first that I just want to make sure everybody realizes this is not a complete listing of every regulation that may apply to a small business. And there's a lot behind these regulations that would require businesses to have, in some cases, written plans, but certainly have strategies behind all of these different regulations. So there's much more to what's here than what I can present in the webinar. But Mary and I are pretty confident that this will get you started if you're not already in the kind of mode of putting together a environmental health and safety plan for your company. So I'll start off with just talking about what the agenda will look like for today. These are the main topics we're going to cover in this presentation. We're going to talk about the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and in the state of Maryland, it's the Maryland Occupational Safety and Health. Both of those agencies have regulations that apply to employees, so worker safety. OSHA is the federal agency, and MOSH, of course, is the state-related agency. The way that works is typically the state, in the case of Maryland, they follow the OSHA regulations, but can also have some extra regulations or even be a little bit more stringent in the regulations than OSHA is, but they have to adopt the OSHA regulations. And virtually all states would be that way as well if they do have a state regulatory agency. Similarly, there's the US EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, and also Maryland has its own set of regulations that are based on the EPA regulations. And that's Maryland Department of the Environment, MDE. And so we'll talk very briefly about hazardous waste. One of the other areas that sometimes affects small businesses is industrial wastewater discharge. That's a fairly complex subject that I'm not really going to cover today, but if you were to be discharging anything into the environment, for example, in a production type of facility, then you would need to know what those regulations are, and you'd need some expertise in that. Mary's going to cover sections on research laboratories, and you can see we've listed chemicals that fall under the Occupational Safety and Health Laboratory Standard. There's a little bit of a difference here between the first bullet that I mentioned, which is the safety of employees, where you're required to have a written plan for all employees. Once you have research laboratories, there's much more specific requirements in this laboratory standard. So she'll talk about that. She'll also talk a little bit about biological material use and radiation and radiological material use. That may or may not apply to all of the listeners right now, but if they do in the future, you'd want to know what all those regulations are that could apply to your company. And then we'll touch briefly at the end on fire safety in laboratories. So I'll start off with talking about worker safety and the OSHA requirements. This is the act that was passed a long time ago now in 1970 to assure safe and healthful work conditions for working men and women. And it is required that employers identify hazards in the workplace that could affect workers and to put plans in place, including training and hazard assessments and other types of measures to be sure that workers are aware of the hazards of their workplace and they know how they should protect themselves in the workplace. And we'll get into a little bit more detail on that. But this is called the OSHA Act, or Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970. So it really is the very beginnings of, for some aspects of what we're going to talk about, this is where it all started. There are some things that predated that, some other types of regulations, but generally this is where we've been talking about worker safety for many decades now. This slide is a little hard to read, but I wanted to show you that this is some of the resources that the Occupational Safety and Health Administration provide for small businesses. On their website, they give you some help on what to do if you're a small business and have to get started on an employee safety, worker safety program. So I would advise that if you haven't already looked at this kind of material, to please go to the OSHA website and see what they have to offer for small businesses. A lot of it is just PDFs that you could just print right off of the website. So it's pretty user-friendly, and it's something that OSHA has really become much more active in trying to help small businesses than perhaps they were in the past. OSHA also requires, as does the state of Maryland, that employers post information for their employees. So I'm showing you here 2 posters that are required in the workplace. The left one is OSHA, the right one is Maryland Occupational Safety and Health Act. They're not meant for you to read on the screen, but I just wanted to show you that they exist. They are free, so you do not have to pay for these. OSHA particularly likes to make sure that small employers, small business employers understand that they don't have to pay for this kind of resource, even though companies will advertise this type of thing for a fee. These are printable right off the website. And basically, it's going to reiterate all of the requirements in the law for ensuring that you have a safe workplace and your employees are trained and understand what the hazards are and know what to do to protect themselves. So those are required. If you're already a company that's operating and you have employees, you need to make sure you have these posters in the work site. If you have more than one location that you're operating, more than one building, for example, or even in more than one state, if you're a big enough company that you're going that direction, you would need to have these posters in all of those workplaces. If you happen to be given a license to work at the University of Maryland on our campus, these posters are already posted for the campus, so you wouldn't have to go out and get these posters for your own company. So we're going to talk about a few aspects of regulations, but there are quite a few of them, way too many for us to go through in today's session. Just wanted to be clear that these are not, for the most part, any types of programs that the University of Maryland implements for small businesses. There are a couple things here and there we'll talk about later on, where if you operate on our campus in a campus building, there may be some program areas that will be involved with you. But in general, small businesses need to develop their own programs, and that means you'll have to develop the expertise to do so, or hire a consultant in some cases to come in and develop your plans. Some of these require written plans. If you're a very small company, you may not need to have as much documentation, but as you start to grow in size, and particularly if your company has 10 or more employees, you start to fall under more requirements for documenting different types and record keeping for different regulations. So this is some of the OSHA regulations that can typically apply to small businesses, or really many businesses. Hazard communication, I'll talk about in a little bit more detail. Mary is going to cover the hazardous chemicals in laboratories. That's that lab standard that I mentioned earlier on. You do need to make sure that your employees understand how to exit a building, how to get out if there's an emergency. Again, if you're operating in a campus building, there are fire marshals and other types of inspections and fire drills that may cover that for you. But if you're not operating in a University of Maryland facility, you'd need to know from your landlord what all those requirements are and what kinds of signage and other planning is going on in that building. And then exposure to different types of things in the workplace. If there's noise in the workplace, if you're working with hazardous materials, if you are doing large production, you might need a process safety management plan. Hazardous waste operations and emergency response is the spill response or release response part of if you have hazmat in your labs, for example. Who and how do you respond? Who comes to help if it's a large spill? You'd need to have that documented and your employees trained on that. Use of personal protective equipment and so forth. So these are just some of the OSHA regulations. Once again, if you aren't familiar with these or you only know a few of them, one way you can learn more is to go to the OSHA website and just spend a little time looking through their resources, both the small business aspects, but also just look at what the regulations are. The regulations, if you read them, are pretty dry, but they also have a lot of resources that make it much easier to understand the regulations on their website. So it's a pretty user-friendly, I would say, at this point, looking for resources on OSHA's website. So there's also a requirement for record keeping, and this is really important, and it would apply if your business is a little bit larger. As I said, if you have 10 employees or more, you're starting to get into the requirements to document these types of records. So if you have any kind of work-related injuries or illnesses, I'm going to show you a little bit more about that in a minute on another slide. If you have any work-related illnesses, hearing loss, needle sticks. And by the way, it may not apply to anybody on this webinar, but if you do have any workers that are in a higher risk category for COVID-19 exposure because of the work they do, an example would be healthcare workers. Then you may need to document and you certainly need to have a safety plan around how to keep workers safe from COVID if that's a specific work exposure that they would have. And then there's some reporting forms, which I'll explain in a moment. So again, if you're a little bit larger company and you have work-related injuries or illnesses, you're required by OSHA to have a log of work-related injuries and illnesses, as I just mentioned. And this is a snapshot of that form. This form gets filled out with the where it happened, what happened to the employee, when it happened to them, what the outcome was, if they lost time from work, those kinds of things. And then ultimately, every year, the employer would be required to do a summary of all of those injuries and illnesses. And on a summary form, without the injured employees' names on it, post that for employees to see once a year. And you have to post that in February and through the month of April, through the end of March. So you have a requirement to post these in the workplace if it applies, if your company is large enough to meet that criteria. So OSHA's got all kinds of, as I mentioned, resources, and you'll have these slides in the YouTube video that Ala mentioned. There's the small business website. There's also a small business handbook. There's a snapshot of that to the right, if you can see that. And then information on that record keeping that I just mentioned, that's also available on their website. It's not easy stuff to read through, but if you spend time with it, most people, I think, can learn what the necessary aspects are. Or if you really have a larger company, more complicated things and too much that you can't just assign it to an existing employee, there are plenty of consultants out there, and Mary or I can help you with that if you need some advice on consultants. Next category I want to mention is the EPA and Maryland Department of the Environment hazardous waste regulations. So very generally, hazardous waste, and I'm going to show you the categories of hazardous waste in the next slide, but places of employment that generate hazardous waste are required to ensure that the waste, when it gets removed from their facility, and by the way, you don't pour it down a drain, it's got to be collected and handled as hazardous waste, needs to be transported safely by companies that are permitted to do so. And then it has to go to a final resting place. As you can see, there's different ways it can be handled. Sometimes it can be recycled, sometimes it can be treated. Often it's going to be disposed of at a hazardous waste disposal site. As an employer, you'd be responsible for cradle to grave, meaning from the point that you generated it until it finds its final legal resting place, you are responsible as an employer. These regulations carry with them really high fines. OSHA also can fine if they come in and do an inspection of your work site and find violations with the worker safety regulations. But the environmental regulations are often even higher than that. So you have to be really cautious with this regulation. This is nothing to fool around with. It needs to be done appropriately, and it needs to be done in accordance with all the regulations. So this is the general categories of what hazardous waste is. And the EPA calls these materials hazardous waste. Maryland Department of the Environment uses the term controlled hazardous substances, but they're basically talking about the same thing. If any kind of waste that you are generating from research, from production, if you're doing any kind of production, from general facilities management types of functions, if that's responsibility of your business, if they fit any of these four categories: ignitability, corrosivity, reactivity, toxicity, then you have a hazardous waste. One thing that we sometimes see that you have to be very cautious of is people make a generalization that, oh, what I'm handling is safe enough to use. It's really not hazardous. It's really not up to you or your business whether it's hazardous. It's up to the EPA and MDE to decide whether it's hazardous. So you really need to know what you're disposing of, what you're no longer going to use, and then if it fits into any of those hazard categories, making sure you have a program to take care of that. The University of Maryland has a hazardous waste program that's run by our department, Environmental Safety, Sustainability, and Risk. We do hazardous waste management for some of the companies that operate on our campus in the TAP building, also known as the Rabin building. That is a program that's been established as a coordinated program for the occupants of that building. So if any of you happen to be in that building or will be in the future, the program would be run through the university. You would pay for the waste, but the university would manage the program on your behalf. If you are operating in another building or elsewhere off of campus, if you're in a non-university building, you'll need to find out either from a landlord whether they have a hazardous waste program, if this applies to you, or if you need to create your own program. So very important. All these regulations are important, but this one gets a lot of focus and does have pretty high fines if you violate. And it's pretty easy regulations to violate. Very complicated, a lot of paperwork involved, and the hazardous waste that you generate can be also a code for different types of commercial hazardous waste, and it can be very confusing. They've got pages and pages of codes and waste, so you really have to spend a lot of time in this regulation to make sure you're doing it right. So focusing in on what Maryland requires, this is the types of things that you would need to do if you're going to have to run your own hazardous waste program. You're going to have to arrange for shipment to a facility that's permitted, as I mentioned, to either treat it or bury it or do whatever they're going to do as a final disposal. The hauler has to be certified by MDE, and there's documents, hazardous waste manifests, that need to be completed, and they need to be done accurately. You have to comply with whatever regulations apply to the storage of your waste. And so depending on the amount of waste you generate, there's some different requirements. If you have very little waste, it's a little easier. If you have a lot of waste, you're going to have more regulations. So you need to understand that part of it. And I put here the reference of where these regulations appear in the Title 26 Code of Maryland Regulations. So again, something that you should be really looking at and reading through if it applies. And there's also an email and a phone location that you can call if you need help from the regulator, if you need help from them to, and sometimes that happens. Sometimes there's some nuances in these regulations that it may mean that you need to have a conversation with the regulator to figure out what applies. So there's two different, or actually more than two, but there are different categories of generators depending on how much you are generating. And they differ. The EPA is a little bit different from MDE. Once again, if your company is operating in the state of Maryland, you're going to comply with the MDE list here. If you happen to have a company that operates outside of the state of Maryland, you'd have to check with that state's requirements. And it may mean that you have to comply with the EPA or very similar to what the EPA requires. So you can see here in the Maryland MDE section, the small quantity generators are those that generate less than 100 kilograms per month and 1 kilogram or less of acute hazardous waste. And that's a category, again, that you'd have to look at to see whether the waste you generate fits into that more toxic, let's call it, hazardous waste category. And then there's the fully regulated generator that generates more than the 100 kilograms per month. So this is really going to depend how you're regulated on how much waste you're generating per month. Everyone that generates hazardous waste is going to need to get an EPA ID number. So this is one of the things you want to start with if you haven't already, and if your company is starting to operate and will be, or already is operating and will be generating hazardous waste. There's a link here to get the EPA ID number. There's a bit of a process to that. There's an application form and so forth. So it's not something you want to wait until you've got a shipment ready to go and then try to get the EPA ID number. You want to get that first. That number is what you need before any hazardous waste hauler or the university can come and pick up your waste. You're going to need that number. So that's something to do early on in the process. And then, as I mentioned, there's different aspects to the regulations here. There's on-site, how you manage your waste while it's still in your company's hands, when it's in a laboratory, for example, or another location that your company has for hazardous waste. There's regulations for shipping it off-site. You have to train employees that are handling hazardous waste. And that includes people that are putting waste into containers that become hazardous waste. So your personnel that are working in a research lab or a facilities area that take the waste and put it into a common waste area, they have to be trained. And then you absolutely have to have emergency response procedures and training if you are generating waste. So here's some EPA resources also for small businesses. There's a small business website that has a lot of good information on it. And similarly to OSHA, there's a small business handbook. I would highly advise you to get copies of these. You can go right to their website and just download the PDFs on these. You don't have to go buy them. And I think they'd be very helpful to you. And MDE also has, the Maryland Department of the Environment Hazardous Waste also has a PDF on how to work through their hazardous waste management program. This is a slide that I took off the EPA. Part of this is blocked right now by my Zoom screen, so I apologize that I can't read what the title says on it. Hopefully you can see it better than I can. But I wanted to show you that the EPA also provides other resources for other aspects, or including hazardous waste. There's a small business ombudsman hotline. So if you need help as a small business, the EPA promotes the idea that they want to assist citizens and small businesses in questions they may have. So that may be a resource for you. There's also some pollution prevention information available. There's a national library and a hazmat center. So once again, the agencies, while they are regulatory and they will fine you, and there can even be criminal penalties on some of these regulations if it gets into an extreme circumstance. They generally are pretty helpful and try to be as much as they can supportive of small businesses. So I'm going to stop for a minute. I don't know if there's been any questions that have come in, but if there are, we can take questions now, and then Mary Dorman's going to talk a little bit about research labs in a minute. I don't see anything in the Q&A. I don't know if there's anything. If there's nothing there, then we'll just wait till the end to answer questions.
No, there isn't any questions, so.
Okay.
Feel free to
So we'll
continue.
move on. But don't forget, if you'd like to ask questions, the Q&A is available for you to do that, and we'll keep an eye on it. And so I'm going to turn this over to Mary Dorman.
Okay, good afternoon. So OSHA has the lab standard, we call it, and it is occupational exposure to, let me get the title correct here. It is occupational exposure to hazardous chemicals in the laboratory. And that is the laboratory equivalent, you could say, to the HAZCOM standard. So OSHA recognizes that people who work in laboratories are probably more familiar and knowledgeable of different hazards that they work with. And so there's somewhat of a relaxation, if you could call it that, as opposed to the HAZCOM standard. But the very important thing about this standard in 1910, 14, 50 is that the work that's being conducted in the laboratories actually meets OSHA's definition of laboratory scale. And so that means that the substances in which the containers used for reactions, transfers, and handling are designed to be easily and safely manipulated by one person. If that's the case, then the OSHA lab standard applies. If it's not the case, maybe as Maureen mentioned, in production facilities, very large quantities in certain areas, then the OSHA lab standard probably doesn't apply. It should be looked at and evaluated to see if it would apply to your company. And then you'd have to go to the HAZCOM standard. Now, one of the important things for companies to recognize is that the OSHA lab standard starts with the company identifying a chemical hygiene officer, right? And this is a person, a single person who's designated by the employer, qualified by training and experience to provide technical guidance to development and implementations and the provisions of a chemical hygiene plan. And the chemical hygiene plan is actually like a written document that's created by the employer. And it sets forth all those procedures in the laboratory for handling hazardous materials. So which kinds of equipment will be used, which personal protective equipment will be worn to control the hazards, and practices are in place that are capable of protecting employees from the health hazards presented in that space. The OSHA lab standard is pretty prescriptive about what should be in a chemical hygiene plan. And there are appendices that are recommended, but they have a really good checklist that you can go through to create, a pretty well-defined chemical hygiene plan that would apply. So for handling chemicals in the spaces, this would apply to your company. There's also material-specific standards, and so OSHA has fact sheets. There's some links that you can go through, and there's links in there that if you're handling special chemicals, additional OSHA regulations may apply. And one of them that comes to mind is formaldehyde. There's a formaldehyde standard. So if that's the case, there could be a lot more necessary in terms of managing, controlling the risks with certain chemicals. But the first part to start with chemical use in a research setting for a company is to look at the OSHA lab standard and review that process. And also the OSHA fact sheets are a good starting point. Next slide. I don't know if I have control over the.
Hang on, I just gotta.
Okay. There are research-specific materials that are used in laboratories that have their own regulations. And so select agents, recombinant DNA, OSHA, bloodborne pathogens, they have unique standards as well, employer would need to understand the definitions and what applies. Many of these come with, in addition to chemicals, with training requirements, with recombinant DNA. The laboratory, the research company would have to be aware of the institutional biosafety committee requirements or NIH guidelines that would apply. If radiation or radioactive material is being used, so any radiation generating equipment or ionizing radiation of radioactive material sources, companies may need to apply for a license from the state of Maryland. So Maryland is an agreement state, and Maryland has chosen to oversee radiation and radioactive material use in the state of Maryland. And they have equivalent or greater than regulations meeting the NRC rules or more stringent. And in fact, Maryland, like many agreement states, do tend to go above and beyond the NRC regulations that would apply to licensees. And so Maryland's regulations for use of radioactive material and radiation can be found in COMAR. And they also have a webpage landing that walks you through what would be required to register an X-ray machine to your company and what would be required to start a license of radioactive material. The laboratory need to be aware of any regulations that surround the movement of samples. So if there's going to be shipment of materials, samples, chemicals, obviously radioactive or biological materials, the Department of Transportation has very stringent rules on the shipping and transport of dangerous goods. And those are found in 49 CFR for ground or IATA for air transport. These, if not adhered to, could result in significant fines. There's very strongly regulated around the movement of dangerous goods on roads. What's interesting is to be aware of is that even dry ice samples or lithium batteries and sometimes some consumer products can fall into what DOT would consider to be dangerous goods. And any shipment of material, of hazardous material or chemicals, things that meet the definitions of dangerous goods for DOT requires that individuals are trained. There's specific paperwork that has to be done. The boxes have to be selected appropriately to control the materials. And so it's very, very highly regulated. So any company, whether this probably could apply even if you're not in a laboratory research setting, but if there's any hazardous or dangerous goods materials being transported by a company, this regulation would apply. And then the laboratory, there's a lot of regulations. So, so I list lasers here. So ANSI has a standard for the use of lasers, open beam lasers. There's training requirements, there's program implementation to control the risks associated with potential for eye or skin injuries with lasers. Non-ionizing radiation as well. So laboratories might be using UV light in transilluminators or particular pieces of equipment in a laboratory, or perhaps there's a piece of equipment that provides for static magnetic fields. All of these different risks have some guidelines, best practice, industry guidelines or recommendations associated with them that would have to be reviewed and implemented for the research setting in the space. And then the individuals in that space need to be trained on it and understand how to protect themselves from that. And then sometimes in the case of ionizing radiation or static magnetic fields, sometimes those fields can extend beyond the perimeter of the actual laboratory they're used. So it's important there's also some public limits associated with these different materials that would have to be explored. And then there's probably 50 plus other regulations that might apply, such as companies that are going to be using explosives or companies that are going to use controlled substances or DEA controlled substances. They may require licensing. So So there are many regulations that would apply in the laboratory space. You're on mute.
Thank you. I'll take this back on for this final slide, or one of the final slides here. So we wanted to talk a little bit about fire safety in research labs. There are requirements in laboratories, but this also actually applies anywhere that you are operating. There'll be likely, whether it's on campus or an off-campus location, there'll be someone that is walking through buildings for fire safety purposes. And so on the University of Maryland campus, we have a fire marshal's office. That's part of our department. And they represent the state fire marshal when they go and look in different locations on campus to ensure that all of the applicable building codes and so forth are being followed. And that includes NFPA 45, which requires laboratories that are using chemicals to have a fire safety plan and emergency procedures. So we talked about a lot of safety in the OSHA standards, and Mary mentioned research safety, but this is another aspect of safety that you need to be in compliance with in virtually any building. Buildings are built in a way that is supposed to reflect how the space is going to be used. And so buildings will be built typically to understand if it's going to be a place where it's going to be regular business, or if it's going to be a higher hazard location. But the reality is that doesn't always happen when space gets assigned. The original intent of the development of the building may now be different. So there can be some limitations sometimes placed on companies as well as university laboratories in the amount of flammable liquids, for example, that can be stored in a location. So that's one of the things that the fire marshal would be able to advise on if there are questions about how much you can store and what you can store in certain spaces, in certain parts of buildings. That's a question that they can help with. If you have any chemicals, you do need to have safety data sheets for them. These used to be called material safety data sheets. They are now called safety data sheets. They've been updated in their format, so they're more user-friendly and have more information on them than in the old days. But that is a method of communicating to people that are going to be using these materials, as well as the emergency responders and others that would go into the space where these hazardous materials are in use. So this is an important aspect, both from an OSHA perspective and from an emergency management perspective, to have safety data sheets. They can be in file cabinets, or they can be in an online fashion, but you have to have access to them. I mentioned that there are limits often for the storage of flammable and combustible liquids. That's something the fire marshal would review and discuss, or if necessary, the fire marshal does have the authority to issue a violation that needs to be corrected. You can't exceed limits, for example, for the number of compressed gas cylinders that are able to be in a certain space. And the fire marshal will typically also inspect for electrical safety violations, because obviously electrical safety can lead to fires. So that is under their purview to take a look at electrical safety. Depending on where your company is operating now or in the future, you may be subject to county fire codes and ordinances as well. So there is, the university only has a reach for its facilities, and there are state requirements that the fire marshal, the university fire marshal, would inspect any state building in the area. For example, if there are state-owned buildings in the city of College Park, the fire marshal might be inspecting those as well. But in some jurisdictions, you might end up with county fire codes. So that code enforcement official would come through the county, not the state. There's a lot of fire code requirements, not just NFPA 45. I point that out because that's one that's specific to laboratories, and I suspect some of the viewers of this call are are doing some type of research and development. There are other types of fire codes. Generally, again, if you're working at the university, the fire marshal will be inspecting facilities and identifying corrections that are needed. And those corrections will go to whoever has the ability to make the correction, whether it's somebody operating a lab on campus or a facilities department that is responsible for the facilities aspects. But it is an area not to forget when you are thinking about how you're going to operate your facility, and especially if you're going to use any kind of hazardous materials. So, and at the end, we just leave some acronyms because we're throwing a lot of acronyms around just in case people are not familiar with the acronyms, but that's really the purpose of the last slide. So with that, I think Mary and I have sort of presented what we hope is a good opening for you if you're not already familiar. Some of you may already be familiar with some of this because you've have perhaps been working or studying on campus. You may have a research lab on campus. You may be a graduate student that has been studying on campus and working in labs on campus. And this is just the next step, is to go into a private company. So some of it's familiar, I think. Some of it may not be as familiar. My suggestion here is that you spend some time looking through these slides and perhaps going to these regulatory websites to see what's there, and then deciding what might apply and how are we going to be able to implement them. What do we need to know and how do we do that? You might be able to send a current employee for training to be able to learn how to do some of this, but again, these regulations can be pretty complex in a lot of cases. There are some specific circumstances where the university may be involved with you. I mentioned the waste generation in the Rabin building, but in general, the university is not providing services to private companies. So this is something that you really need to look into. We have a lot of information on our website, and we can be a resource. We don't mind a phone call asking questions. We can't run your environmental health and safety program for you, but we can help answer questions or give you some direction on where you might find more information if that would be helpful. Mary, did you have any final comments you wanted to make?
Not at this time, no.
Okay. All right. So with that, we're done with our presentation. I don't, if there's any questions, I'm not still seeing anything in the Q&A, but if there's any questions, we'd be happy to answer them. And otherwise, we wish you all well with your companies. We hope everything goes really well. And if there's something we can do to help answer questions, we'd be happy to do so.
Thank you, Maureen and Mary. At this time, I'd like to introduce a poll with a few questions so we can get your feedback on today's presentation, please. And while people are answering the questions, feel free to type in your Q&A, or you can raise your hand and I can unmute you and you can ask your question if you like. Okay, I'd like to thank each and everyone for participating in our poll. And once again, I'd like to thank Mary and Maureen. Thank you for your presentation. It was a lot of information, very informative, helpful. I learned a lot as well. So thank you for sharing. And thank you each and everyone for participating today, and do have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.